Noon or whatever time it is, wherever you are, and welcome to POGO for March. Particularly well done to anyone who's enjoying a sunny day in the UK and is on our call and not in the garden. So well done you. Let me start with a couple of minor bits and bobs. First of all, massive thank you to everyone who contributed to our green paper response. We made it, we submitted it, and it is available online. And we also, Rory and I did a blog post summarizing the key points. So if you don't have time to read the whole thing, you can read the blog post. So do take a look at that if you haven't seen it already, and obviously we'll see what happens with that. Rory and I will be discussing that at a webinar, which is looking at UK procurement reform post-Brexit, organised by Michael Bauscher QC and Chris Eukins, who's often on these calls. And that's in your email, little plug for that. So if you'd like to come along and support us, ask us difficult questions, ask us not difficult questions, that would be absolutely super. We'd love to see you. And the GoLab Social Outcomes Conference 2021, the call for papers has now gone live for that. So if anybody's got anything they want to get off their chest, that is your opportunity. So we have got for today, for your delectation, two fantastic presentations with opportunities for Q&A. And without further ado, I'm going to move on to the first of those. So our first topic is how to leverage procurement to improve social outcomes. And we are joined by Elena Hoffnagle. Thank you, Elena, for being with us today. It's lovely to have you, who is a project leader on this at the Government Performance Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School. And she's going to be talking us through the guidebook that they've recently published, Crafting a Results-Driven Request for Proposals. I've dipped into that a little bit and it's great stuff. So very much looking forward to hearing more about it. And please, as always, store up your questions for Elena and there will be an opportunity to ask those after her presentation. So Elena, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. As Anne mentioned, my name is Elena Hoffnagle, and I'm a project leader at the Harvard Kennedy School Government Performance Lab. And we are a research lab based out of Harvard University, and our focus is on improving social outcomes in the ways that state and local governments in the US do business. We are much more of kind of an implementation lab than just a purely research lab. We have done over 100 projects with jurisdictions across the United States. And the main way that we do our work is through our GPL fellows. So we hire and train folks who are usually a year or two out of getting a master's in public policy or law or business, and actually embed those folks with a government agency for a year so that they can be a real focus change agent within that government agency. We also bring together a national network of state and city innovators, as well as develop a variety of different publications and tools and resources for local governments and state governments in the United States. We focus on a variety of different issue areas, including behavioral health, child welfare, criminal justice, education, and jobs. But procurement and contracting is really a core theme throughout all of our work, because in the United States, nearly all of these services are delivered through a contract with an outside entity. And so the ways that governments procure for those services and manage those contracts is directly related to whether or not outcomes are achieved for those services. Our set of strategies that we've developed over the years, working with a variety of different state and local governments, we call results-driven contracting. So these are the kind of the core principles that we hope that state and local governments will achieve to be able to have better outcomes for their residents. And I'll say that for those who aren't as familiar with procurement in the United States, cities and states can basically create their own procurement code, their own procurement practices, their own procurement policies. And so what procurement looks like from one city government to another can be very, very different. In some cases, it's a centralized body within that city. In some cases, every department or agency within that city can really develop their own policies and practices. And so what we're often aiming to do when we work with city governments is make their procurement process more efficient, more inviting, and more transparent. I worked with a city where in some departments, it took them over 3 years to get a service contract signed. So you can imagine that procurement is one of the most inefficient activities that many local governments are doing. We're also really focused on improving the outcomes of contracted programs, products, and services. So we find that many local governments do a pretty good job of managing the outcomes of work that they control directly, but aren't as focused on what outcomes they're getting from services that they've contracted out. Procurement also is often seen as this administrative back office function. And so what we're aiming to do often is bringing procurement more to the forefront of local government by elevating and resourcing procurement better so that it really can be a strategic function. And then we have a major focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so what that means for our procurement work is that we're often trying to help governments bring in more minority vendors, women vendors, small and local vendors so that they can get their share of contracts as well. And then we're also hoping to see that cities are getting good outcomes for marginalized populations who are recipients of service contracts, whether it's a paving contract, making sure that lower income neighborhoods are getting the same high quality paving services that a higher income neighborhood is, just the same as a workforce development contract or child welfare services. So as Anne mentioned, we recently created this RFP Guidebook, which we're very excited about. This is a hands-on tool to help local governments and state governments draft better requests for proposals. Lee was very helpful letting me know that invitation to tender is also a term that many of you might be using in place of request for proposal. But let me talk through some of the challenges that we find governments facing and how the guidebook responds to that. So we find that staff are very overwhelmed at the prospect of writing an RFP, and they sometimes tend to put it off till the last minute. And so RFPs often are very delayed, very rushed, may get out the door very late. And so what we do in the RFP Guidebook is we give folks a variety of tips and tricks to better project manage the process of writing a request for proposal. Tools to develop a good timeline, tools to figure out what stakeholders need to be consulted as you're writing a request for proposals. A second thing that we find is that governments often are not doing enough research ahead of writing their RFP. They may not be taking into account emerging best practices. They may not talk to the current vendor to hear how services are delivered. Just to give one example, a city we worked on an RFP with for banking services, they were tempted to just recycle the same RFP that they wrote 10 years ago. And as you can imagine, the world of banking services has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. So if they were to just recycle that RFP, they would be missing all of the latest and greatest technology for banking services. And so they really needed to go in this much more in-depth exploration to understand what the current landscape of banking services looks like before writing that RFP. And so in the guidebook, we give a variety of ideas about how to conduct market research, how to learn from your vendors and service recipients before you start writing the RFP so that you have a much more informed document that's going out for that procurement. We also find that a common problem that local governments in the US face is that their RFP isn't centered on a desired end outcome. They may say a ton about what they want the vendor to do, but they haven't stepped back to say what they really want that vendor or that contractor to achieve. And so they're missing this idea of what success looks like. To give an example here, the city of Seattle, Washington, they had a variety of homelessness service contracts, and they could tell you exactly how many showers had been delivered to homeless individuals, but they couldn't tell you how many individuals had actually gotten past homelessness and found a permanent housing environment. And so cities are often very focused on tracking the outputs, but not the outcomes. And so what we do in the guidebook is we give folks a variety of tips around what an outcomes-focused RFP looks like and how to identify that successful outcome. And then finally, oftentimes when folks are writing scopes of work, they're very prescriptive. They have a lot of onerous requirements. We've seen scopes of work that say things like, your truck that you're using to deliver services must have exactly 2-inch high font with your name on it, right? All of these requirements that have nothing to do with the success of service delivery. And so this means that some firms won't even propose on your project, or vendors will feel very limited. And so we give a variety of tips in this guidebook on how to develop a more open-ended scope of work so that providers and vendors can give you their best ideas and actually bring their expertise to the project that you're proposing. So the guidebook, the link is here, and I believe Anne sent it out in an email ahead of time. The guidebook has 8 modules, and these modules are designed to be, you pick them off the shelf if you just want to look at one. These modules take you all the way through planning for your RFP, all the way through managing your contract. In each of the modules, we highlight best practices from other jurisdictions. We also include discussion questions. So discussion questions that you and your team can be thinking about as you're preparing that section of the RFP, as well as planning and drafting prompts. So the idea is that this guidebook takes the task of writing a big complex RFP and breaks it down into more individual chunks that will be much more manageable for your typical, state or local government worker. Wonderful. So thank you so much. I welcome any outreach by email. Please check out our website. You can download the guidebook from the website. My managing director, Carli, couldn't be on the call today, but her email is here as well. And let me I'm going to switch my screen and just give you all just kind of a sneak peek of what this looks like. So here's an example of one of the modules. So this is on writing a scope of work. And as you can see, it goes through kind of all the best practices of how to write a good scope of work to go in your RFP or your invitation to tender, and includes best practices. And then it has 2 different examples. This is an example from the city of Boston. We have an example from a city in Kansas as well. And then it's actually created as a fillable PDF. So governments can use this to gather their thoughts in response to these discussion questions. And then there's a drafting prompt section where we provide instructions on how to draft that section of the RFP. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much, and I will open it up to questions and discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that great presentation, also for sticking beautifully to time. So we are open for questions. I'm going to need some help from Lee to tell me if anyone has got their hand up. I've done my usual thing where I forget to say that this session is being recorded so that we can make it available to people who aren't here. So I say that now, and I hope we told you that ahead of time, Elena. Any questions?
Mara has her hand up.
Mara, please go ahead.
Hi. Elena, this is fantastic. I thought it's an amazing piece of work that you did. My question is sort of a meta question, because I think it's a very helpful resource, and I was wondering if you can share with us how do you incorporate the feedback of the users of these guidance were they involved in designing it? And what do you know what they say is very helpful and what they say, this is not quite there yet? And so what is the process you have to get their feedback?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you so much. So this guidebook actually evolved from work that we were doing with many different city governments. So we had originally designed worksheets because we found that as we were starting to work on a big major RFP that a city government had, it was helpful to break down the process week by week. And this sounds ridiculous, but local government staff actually responded very well to getting a homework assignment each week. And so we developed these worksheets, and in between meetings, the local government staff we were working with would fill out their worksheets, and we would come together and discuss what they had submitted. And we got a lot of feedback over the years on those worksheets. And, you know, I think probably similar to the folks at Oxford, we tended to write things in a very academic sense. And one of the things we learned over the years was we had to really adjust our language. And so you'll see that the language in this guidebook is much kind of friendlier, almost like someone's talking to you about how to do things well. And so we adjusted both the content of the worksheets over time, as well as kind of the way that we were teaching this information. And then we hope that we'll still get you know, more feedback from governments in the future, and you know, can do a V2 a year from now that incorporates that feedback.
Fantastic, thank you. Do we have any other questions? We have some lovely feedback in the chat from Ben Murphy, who's evidently been using it. Ben, do you want to talk about your experience?
Yeah, I mean, not really a question, you just can attest to the value of the documents, not only this one, but the others that your office puts out. It's been really helpful in us understanding and having conversations with different government funders, both at the local and more like state level. So great tools, and happy to see the latest iteration of this.
Thank you so much. That's great to hear.
Thanks, Ben. Have we got any other questions?
Yeah. So we got Rory with a hand up, but I'll just quickly jump in. You were talking about how this evolved over time by sort of working with practitioners to develop this and providing homework. I want to know, maybe it's a negative question, but I want to know whether there were some horror stories that you thought, crikey, we really got to provide a guide here, and how, in your experience, has those horror stories been mitigated by this guide, if at all?
You know, I mentioned that first challenge that these government staff, these practitioners often put writing their RFP until the last minute, and it's really kind of a psychological examination of why people procrastinate in government more than anything. But I had folks, you know, when I was in a city government early on, you know, come to me near tears saying, my boss says we have to release this RFP tomorrow and I have no idea what we want. And I think that's a really common challenge in government, is that people have not come together to really think about what they need a contractor to provide before they issue that RFP. And I think you can see that, I don't know the case in other countries, but for most RFPs in the US, there's a question and answer period where any businesses can submit questions that they have about the RFP. And sometimes you see hundreds of questions come in from vendors, and that's such a sign that you haven't thought about all of the implications of the work that you're contracting out. And so what we're really trying to do with this guidebook is say, your RFP isn't just a quick document you're getting out the door, but it should be this moment where you're pausing to examine your strategic priorities, to examine what you really need from a contractor, to know what success looks like, to know what, you know, ideal service delivery is and who's going to receive that service. And so one of the big things we're pushing is take the time to really figure out what you want and what success looks like.
Great. So in terms of next questions, we have Rory, Mark, and Nigel.
Okay, well, let's take them in that order then. So Rory, you're up first.
Great. Thanks very much for this presentation. It's really helpful. I have a question that relates to that idea of central government versus local government. I know that you highlighted that in the US, the rules at central or federal level don't apply then to the lower. So there are differences between Europe and UK and the US, but still, I feel like sometimes at the central government in UK, for example, there's this idea of, for example, social impact bonds, where there's a lot of the money is tied to outcomes. That's quite a difficult thing to do, and that if local government then need to sort of work out how to tie all this funding to outcomes, then there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. I'm thinking about this because you described, this idea of like, oh, my boss wants me to get something out the door tomorrow, or I need to work more and understand what vendors need. It just seems like sometimes we have really high expectations about the amount of things that a local procurement officer can do, and then other times we're not giving them space to do that. And so I appreciate that there like this capacity development work to be done on the local level, and I think that the international community is aware of that to some extent. But have you seen sort of an opportunity, or have you seen a variety within local government of the appreciation that of appreciation for local government procurement professionals? Like, do people know that it's a profession? Do people have a sense that, well, we've got to give these professionals time to do their job, or are the expectations of them misaligned?
I think that's a great point. I think in many local governments, procurement professionals are not respected. They're not getting time with the mayor or other senior government officials. It's also worth noting that who exists as a procurement professional can be really different from one government to another. In some cases, there's a clear role of a buyer who is drafting the RFP and maybe coaching the department on writing a good RFP. In other cases, a department staff may have full responsibility for writing an RFP. So there's not even really the standardization of roles, but I would say that definitely there's space for procurement as a profession to be elevated and to become more strategic.
Thank you. Mark was up next.
Sorry, can you hear me? I'm struggling on mute. Great. Yeah, hi Elena. I think that was a really good presentation. That was really helpful and really interesting. And the document that sits behind that just does look really useful. I was particularly what resonated with me, I think, is that what you were talking about, the planning being everything, and diving into RFP, to use your language, is the worst thing you can do. I think there's something for me as well, picking up on Rory's point about the sort of reputation of the procurement function, because procurement is a long process, isn't it? We call them sort of upstream, downstream tasks. Downstream tasks are issuing your RFP. There's a whole load of upstream things you need to do if that's going to work properly. I think if you can get procurement in many organisations, you just recognise as the organisation, as the bit of the organisation that sends the RFP out. So that whole education, I think, is about recognising that there's a procurement role across the whole piece. I just wondered, in my world, we do a procurement plan at the start of the process before we start everything, and it picks up a lot of the things that you had in your sort of 1 to 9 boxes. Look at the market, look at where you can add social value, look at what terms and conditions you're going to use, all of that. And we don't let people start a procurement process until they've done a procurement plan, and that's been signed off at a reasonably senior level in the organisation, and that's your strategy as to how you're going to approach it. I just wonder whether any of your guidance sort of incorporated that as best practice, or if not, what the sort of governance process you recommend is to make sure that people actually do this.
Mark, I love that comment. You're really speaking my language. I think that's our exact ideal, that a procurement plan is happening that sets clear roles and responsibilities and sets a clear timeline for the procurement. I would say that's very rare. Especially in smaller local governments. It's much more of an ad hoc process where, someone kind of works on it and then someone else works on it, and then it comes to the attention of a procurement office. So I think you're totally right. That's what everyone should be doing.
And then you get to the end of it and you think, I wouldn't have started from here, don't you?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I think probably the last question we have time for is the one that was lined up from Nigel.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, it's really, really great, and the document looks great. I look forward to reading it more. I guess my question is, have you had any pushback? Is there anyone who says, you know, you're getting something wrong, or the guidance is perhaps not quite hitting the mark? Are there particular groups of providers that think, you know, favor a different approach, or indeed, you know, bits of government that just think, oh, well, that's not realistic or whatever? Just interested if you've had any of that sort of feedback.
Yeah, we haven't had that feedback directly, but I think the pushback I'm anticipating is government saying this is far too complex of a process for our typical RFP. And if we did this level of work for every RFP, we would never get anything out the door. And so we've tried to say in this guidebook that this is the approach you should do for either high dollar value RFPs, innovative RFPs, RFPs that, you know, are on the mayor's radar, and, you know, keep using your normal approach for just the standard run of the mill type RFP. So I'm anticipating that pushback. And then we've also heard from people that, you know, this isn't the best approach for, say, a technology RFP for some big software implementation. And so we're thinking about customizing this guidebook in the future so that, you know, there's a separate section or version for tech RFPs or for complex social services or something like that. Thanks.
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 Having said last question, I just wanted to check, Gian Luigi, is there anything you'd like to ask about this before we move on to?
I thought we didn't. Thanks, Anne. I think I thought we didn't have time for one more. It's just a very, you know, it's an urgent curiosity, because I've been in touch recently with the people at NASPA. And so I was wondering whether, I'm sorry, maybe I'm telling completely trivial thing, but I wonder whether this project led you, your team, into some sort of relation with NASPA, because they have a lot of, training tools for all that. So I was wondering whether and to what extent you had sort of crossed your path with them.
Yeah, I don't do much work with state governments, and NASPA is a primarily state-focused organization. But so I know
municipal. Okay,
I do more municipal. Yeah.
Okay.
My colleagues who do work with state governments, they've definitely talked to NASPA about this, and we're hoping to do a webinar to all of their members this summer to keep getting the word out.
Okay. Thanks.
No, thanks. Great.
I had the suspicion, but I wanted to make sure that you were.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Massive thanks to Elena for that presentation, and it's been great to see the documentation, and there's lots more to look at there. So I'm sure lots of things for people to follow up. So thank you very much for joining us today and sharing that work with us. So second part of our session today, we have a presentation from Gian Luigi Albano, who is a procurement expert and a professor of economics in Rome. And he is going to be talking about some insights on framework agreements from his book, co-authored with Caroline Nicholas, who's also on the call from UNCITRAL. The book is called The Law and Economics of Framework Agreements, Designing Flexible Solutions for Public Procurement. We started talking a little bit about framework agreements in the green paper response, where we were thinking creatively, or at least Rory was thinking creatively. I'm going to drop you right in it here, about whether these could be used in more social settings. So we thought it'd be good to get a bit more insight into framework agreements in general terms. So Gian Luigi, the floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you, Anne. So I was asked to test myself with this ambition of summarizing a 380-page book in 7 minutes. So this is going to be the test of my life from an interviewer point, whether I'm able. And so if I succeed, obviously you will have, the first answer would be, why didn't you write only 10 pages rather than 380 pages of that book? jokes apart, thanks for inviting me. I think that as an economist, my interest in framework agreement stemmed from a very extremely, I would say, practical urgency of answering a question that actually, by the way, in Northern Ireland, UK, people raised, almost 30 years ago. So procurement is intrinsically a repeated activity, and especially 30 years ago, they used to be carried out in a similar fashion, buying over time PCs, janitorial services, you name it. And so people in the practice had this urgency of solving the problem, not repeating exactly the same process from scratch every year, every 2 years. And so framework agreements were born as a response of trying to address an extremely, I would say, economic aspect of the procurement dimension, which is saving transaction costs. So why running from scratch the same tender all over again every once per year, rather than having, it's sort of what we call in the UK, in the US, they call the master contract or the framework agreement, sort of a set of clauses establishing the rules of the game for a series of contracts to be awarded, say within 1, 2, 3 years, so on and so forth. So the idea is to bundle under the same umbrella, and this is why actually the US, these are called umbrella contracts. Some of the terms of the contracts to be awarded at a later stage. And so this is really an extremely practical urgency of saving the administration of that. Now, when Carli and myself used to meet each other physically in a lot of international conferences several years ago, we ended up discovering that, in fact, there are many practices all over the world in which we basically do the same thing, but we put them different labels. And so we don't understand each other. So if you go to Brazil, you have your Brazilian experts say, oh, we have a price registration system. Then you come to Europe, you have a framework agreement. You go to the US, you have a IDIQ or multiple award schedules. And you tend to believe that you're handling different stuff, although in fact, you're handling almost exactly the same item. So this is idea, it's a two-stage process whereby you select, in many circumstances, not in all circumstances, a subset of suppliers at the first stage, and then you put them in the same perimeter for a while, and then there is a sequence of contracts to be awarded at a later stage, and you may decide, to award them directly or to reopen competition, one way or the other. So there is this underlying idea that contracts have something similar, although you have they may be heterogeneous. So they have some common items and specific items. So the idea is that why not bundling the common items at the first stage, so that at the second stage you take care only of the specifics of the particular contract, a public contract. That would, in a way, raise your fixed costs at the first stage and save on your variable costs at the second stage. It's a very economic argument driving the whole series. Now, obviously, you may imagine that depending on the subject matter, or, this is what the legal expert would say, economists would say, the content of the contract, you may decide to establish a lot of terms at the very first stage and postpone until the second stage very little or very few contractual clauses, or the other way around. So in a way, this is why in the title there is a flexible word. It depends on the nature of what you want to buy, whether and to what extent you're going to establish some of the terms, you're going to fix them at the very first stage, and which ones you're going to establish or further specify at a later stage. So theory ends very quickly. Oh, by the way, I got interested in that, not because I'm working for a buyer purchasing similar things over time, which seems to be the most natural way of using framework agreement. I am a big buyer. I'm the city of Austin, and then I need to buy whatever excavator services, name it, or you know, whatever road maintenance services over a period of time, and then I am the one really getting the services. But there is another application which in Europe has become increasingly very interesting, which is demand aggregation stemming from different parts of the government, local government, state government, ministries, regions, municipalities. And this is what central purchasing bodies, or more generally centralized agencies, were created for. So aggregating demand. So framework agreements have become the most natural purchasing technique for centralized agencies in order to meet the needs of buyers which basically buy similar thing, although not exactly the same thing, okay? And that's basically the story. Now, that's the end of the theory. Now, if you want to make a step, if you want to move into the business, you have to be a little bit more precise. So what are you going to buy, okay? So what kind of a market you're facing? You're facing a market with a lot of firms, few firms, small and medium enterprises, you name it. So depending on these, on the environment, all these ingredients will fed into the design of a specific framework agreement. But basically, what happens is that the flexibility allows you to move from one extreme, in which a framework agreement is only 1 centimeter away from a supplier list. And actually, to be honest, when I look at some of the UK examples of framework agreements, I cannot see anything different from a suppliers list, to be honest, where the subject matter is defined very loosely. There are tons of firms which are admitted to the framework, and then everything happens at the second stage, okay? And this is one extreme. The other extreme is basically more closer to the Italian experience, in which almost everything is defined at the very first stage. And the only thing that really has to be determined at the second stage, what we normally call the Calloff stage, is only the quantities that will be purchased by the single entity. So this is, I was born in a world in which there is a single contract for everybody. So all the conditions, you know, technical specifications, financial conditions are frozen at the award stage, so at the conclusion stage of framework, so the first stage. And then the only thing that really happens at the second stage is that the municipality of Milan will buy 1,000 PCs from this big contract. So it's flexible in that you can move almost freely, almost without any loss of continuity, from one extreme in which you have a merely supplier list to a case in which you have a ready-to-be-used contract, which will serve, say, tens or even hundreds of different contracting authorities. Now, which particular point you're going to pick from in the 0-1 interval depends upon your need, depends upon your potential suppliers, depends on your objectives. You want to save on the administrative cost. You're happy with, you know, if you're in Italy, you will be under the pressure of having a lot of these colleagues of yours in local government who don't want to have any hassle in handling a second stage of competition, and they ask you to say, oh, give me a ready-to-use contract. So you will be almost forced to establish all the terms of the first stage, so that at the second stage, everything is already complete and ready to be used. But if you do that, you will lose a lot of tailoring, a lot of specific items you can add. And so this will conflict, for instance, with the UK experience. And I'm mentioning the UK experience because to me, this is the practice of the UK is really on the other extreme of the framework agreement family spectrum, in which you want to exactly guarantee that each single contracting authority, final user, will be in a position to adjust twist and bend the framework agreement in a way that meets that specific need or those specific needs in a particular region or a particular municipality. Now, there is absolutely the one point that I want to make, and I think this is done at page 200 something in the book, is that so I've spared you the pain of going through 250 pages. So the point is, and the point that we independently made, both Caroline and myself, is that if you want to go browse over this book to find for the optimal solution or the big recipe to solve your problems, forget it. No way. So we're not the kind of guys providing solutions. We're providing a toolbox to think about the problem, how to logically frame your problem, but the actual solution will depend on a list of priorities, or as economists would say, objective function that will change and will be different from one country to another, even if we buy exactly the same item. And when I say exactly the same item, we want to buy very standardized IT equipment. Forget about the fancy services that we sometimes will put in our framework contract, energy efficiency, lighting services. Forget about the complicated stuff. If you want to buy really simple stuff, depending on your priorities, then you may end up with completely different solutions. So this is something extremely important because it's your objective function driving the design and not the other way around. And this is something that with Caroline, I think we have touched with our hands, that the very fact that we have in two circumstances, two different solutions, then we're sort of tempted to say, oh, this is the bad thing, this is the good thing, okay? There is a bad thinking and there is the good thinking, but it's not a bad solution or a good solution. That's a completely different story, okay? It's the approach that matters. But given that we may start from a completely set of priorities, we may end up by using exactly the same logic to different designs. And this is very important because to me, I mean, I've delivered, I don't know how many seminars on framework agreements. And there is always this temptation of saying, oh, give me the experience we can copy and paste here. There is no copy and paste kind of strategy that works. And this is something I've learned as a practitioner, and we still bear the scars of our mistakes, but that's the point. There's always this temptation of looking for the good practice, not even the best practice, the good practice. There is no good, there is a good practice in terms of using the logical tools appropriately, but not the unique solution that works, sort of, one size fits all kind of approach. So now if we had the 2 more hours, you would say, oh, give me one example and we would work this out together. But then from now onwards, we should put our minds at work on one single concrete case and then exercise and train ourselves in applying these very stylized logic to a concrete case. So I'm done with the theory, Anne. And so if you want to, feed in some more practical, details, I'm happy. But I don't think I want to sort of stretch it any further because that would be unfair towards my co-author first and towards what we've done. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gian Luigi, for that great presentation. I am just going to first of all check whether Caroline has anything that she would like to add as your co-author.
Thank you very much, and hi to everybody. What I normally say in these situations is I agree with Gian Luigi because I do. But just to take a step back, and I've just put a couple of comments in the chat. Framework agreements itself is just an umbrella term, and as everybody's saying, they cover everything from what is basically a completed procurement with not much more than an agreed delivery in lots, just the precise dates and the precise quantities need to be finalized, right through to what is effectively a suppliers list and everything in between. And so one of the real challenges that we had is to take away some of the rules-based problems with it, so that as you could focus on what Gian Luigi is talking about, the what are you trying to achieve here? Because if you keep focusing on the rules, you tend not to look at what actually you're trying to achieve. And we found, or at least I found looking at the legal side, that there are so many holes in the way that the legal rules cover these things. For example, is a framework agreement a procurement contract? In many systems, it's not clear. Do all of the procedural rules apply to the second stage? Again, in the EU, we don't think so. Not all of them, some of them perhaps, whatever. So one of the clear things that we think is really important is to have a very clear set of rules, to take all that uncertainty out. And going back to them, I mean, one of the focuses of this group, as I understand it, is looking at social outcomes and how you might deal with those. And one area where Gian Luigi and I really didn't agree is, a very unusual one, is whether or not you can award contracts using a rotation approach. So, you know, this time, this time, this time, this time. And technically, my view is that under just about every procurement system I've seen, you can't, because you have to award it to the most economically or the most advantageous tender. And where you're located is unlikely, not impossible, but is unlikely to come within that. There's lots and lots of fiddly little legal questions to get out of the way, so that you can focus on what you're trying to do. And so this is also our practical focus in writing the book, was to try and identify the differences, the way some of these things are treated, so that you can move on past this. And so I would just say, from a sort of policy perspective, it doesn't matter so much whether you get the best answer for any of these legal questions, but for goodness sake, make sure your system has an answer, even if it's not perfect. It's just, this is what you have to do, and this is what you may not do, and there's a little bit of discretion, because there's far too much, I'm not sure if this works or it's not works, that goes on in framework agreements. And also, just to say, as I popped in the chat, the point that Elena was making and that Gian Luigi about planning, framework agreements are big contracts, and we see insufficient emphasis on that planning stage, because you've got to choose what type of framework and all sorts of economic considerations. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you. Always pleasing for me to get onto fiddly legal questions. I feel I'm in my happy place at that point. Rory, I think you probably might want to kick off the discussion with a couple of questions around that focus on social outcomes.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I wanted to offer some questions about, or comments about, like, so how we got here. I appreciate that we're not going to get a solution, you know, like email. Gian Luigi's not going to follow up with the whole group and say, oh, by the way, here's your model framework agreement that you all need to use. And I think that, you know, a workshop with a working group is probably helpful to help us think through some of these things. But let me make 3 points about, you know, how we got here. The first is there's a green paper that has been recently published by the UK government. Of course, we talked about our response to the green paper earlier. So there is an opportunity to reform the law of public procurement in the UK. So this is, which means that, you know, there's opportunities to clarify some of these issues, but it also means that we're talking about legal reform as opposed to like designing a particular, like, you know, particular framework. Rather, it's about, you know, creating room for particular frameworks perhaps to be set up. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that there are a number of funds being created in the UK around, you know, to help with things like leveling up and building back better. And so there are people are thinking about, well, how do we do this kind of thing effectively? And the third thing I'd like to say is that, you know, we're an evaluation, the Go Lab is an evaluation partner in something called the Life Chances Fund, which is the central government sort of top-up fund for local government commissioned projects that are social impact bonds. So within the Life Chances Fund, there were 30 different procurements, roughly 30 different procurements that happened at the local level for different types of social outcomes under the one central government fund. One of the things we heard was that there are challenges around procurement and the contract negotiation. And so you've got this similar transaction costs being incurred at 30 different locations at the local government level, and the central government's thinking, well, we've got funds top up, and why isn't this happening in a different way? Is my perception. So it occurred to me that, well, maybe some of these things should be, maybe there are opportunities for aggregation of demand, maybe there are opportunities for reducing transaction costs through mechanisms like framework agreements. And now we have this green paper suggesting changes to UK reform. Maybe we should be thinking about this, thinking through some of these issues together. So that's where this is coming from. I'm going to pause there. I think this is the start of a conversation, not the end of one. And I look forward to the discussions.
Gian Luigi, do you want to pick up on any of that, or do you want me to?
I was waiting for more, questions or remarks before adding.
Where's the question, Rory?
No, I wanted to make clear that in fact, when we wrote flexible solutions, in fact, the family of framework agreements they're not that flexible after all. And there is, and if you look at, I can't say I read very carefully the green paper, but I jumped into, the one section that which was my interest. So the dynamic purchasing system, which is for our American call it dynamic purchasing system, is nothing more than an electronic open framework agreement, okay? In the US, framework agreements are naturally open, so you can always you can jump at any point in time, provided that you fulfill some of the conditions. In Europe, if you want to have an open framework agreement, it must be electronic, fully electronic. So, and it seems to me that the UK government sort of realized after 2 EU directives that in fact there are empty spaces somewhere. For instance, normally DPA, dynamic purchasing system, is supposed to be used for common user items. So something that you regularly base kind of standardized items. And in fact, I always question this point. I say, yeah, why? Because it's electronic? Because it's electronic, and so there is an automatic evaluation of tenders, then does this imply logically that we have to buy very simple things? But we're making such a fuss about using artificial intelligence applied to public procurement. So what's the point? We're going to use artificial intelligence for applied to public procurement, then we're going to consider still a DPS as some sort of an environment in which you have to buy only simple things. Why so? I don't see why. And in fact, what happened? UK government responded to this by, having this idea of using what is called DPS Plus. So the enhanced dynamic purchasing system. And secondly, there is an intrinsic weakness, which has always drawn the criticism from the other side of the ocean, is that the framework agreement in Europe is genetically conceived to be closed. Once you select 3 suppliers at the first stage, there will be only a chance for those 3 guys to compete for all the Calloff contract. And so if you establish, this goes back to, I guess, to your example of social impact bonds, of having all this project. And then, so what happens is that if you have, for instance, and it used to be the UK practice, extremely long in terms of duration framework agreements, so you select only 3 firms out of 100, then you might have potential, or even more than potential, concrete anti-competitive concerns, because you are basically given a chunk of the market to a small subset of firms. And guess what? The UK government reacted by saying, oh, we would like to have a much longer in principle, a framework agreement. Mind you, the EU directive, a framework agreement normally can last up to 4 years with some exceptions, right? But the UK is never happy about this, never been happy about the 4 years. So we want to go back to the 1990s, where framework agreements used to last for 10 years. And so in the green paper, there is this novel proposal which says, oh, let's make a framework agreement so the window within which you're allowed to award contract much longer, but then we open the doors of the framework agreement now and then, from time to time, once per year, for instance. Okay, so there is this, I think, and I mean, you know by far better than I know, there is this idea of making some sort of DPS and framework agreement converge to a common ground, making the DPS richer, so look like something that a framework agreement can achieve, and at the same time, by having a framework agreement longer, but reopening the door, so sort of we will make the framework agreement look like more a DPS. I mean, it seems to me a way of making, converging towards some sort of a hybrid. But this is a solution which basically is a potential answer to some existing weaknesses of framework agreements. So the fact that still, in spite of being extremely flexible, there is this idea of closedness, and then obviously you will mind me, you will forgive me if I'm using English language inappropriately, but this idea that if you select 3, there will be 3, okay? So how do we counteract this for instance, in practice? We do know that the framework agreement has a limited duration, so if you block the market for a while, then what we do, we make framework agreements short enough so as to have reopened competition for entry the framework agreement more often. So mind you that there is one trick in this business which might be of interest for you guys working in this social project. So if you need to have a contract duration which is long enough in order to get an outcome, you know, think of unemployment. You're implementing measure to reduce unemployment rate in a particular area. There is absolutely nothing you can do if your project lasts only 18 months. So you need to make investment, you need to take measures. So your procurement contract maybe needs to be a 7-8 year long. But how to put this, how to make a compromise between having a potentially long duration of the contract and having a framework agreement which cannot last for 8 years. So in Italy, when we design framework agreements, not for social project, but for other projects in which the outcome matters, for instance, think of energy efficiency contracts for buildings, okay? So we want to have framework agreements whereby firms undertake huge investments to renew buildings, okay? And we pay them back, not with money, but with a fraction of the savings that they're able to achieve by making those investments. Also, if you look at our strategy, we have the duration of our framework agreement is still limited, 3 years, but the contract, the call-off contracts, which are normally awarded under the umbrella of a 3-year framework agreement, is an 8 to 9 year contract, because this is exactly what you need to give firms in order to make that investment profitable. So there is absolutely no inconsistency between having a sort of a duration of the framework agreement which is reasonably short, 2-3 years, with having a duration of the call-off contract much longer. That contract will need to take into account the essential features of the subject matter. So if you need your vendors to make huge investment, you need to give them the time horizon which is long enough to make that investment profitable. And there is no contradiction this is in a way a strategy to get the best out of the two aspects. So having a short or reasonably short duration of the framework agreement with a much longer duration of the contract. And that might sort of ring a bell for you guys working in projects in which social outcome needs a certain number of years to arise or to emerge out of the investment. Sorry for taking a little bit longer than expected.
No, that was really interesting. Thank you. I know that Abby's been waiting patiently to come in, and I think you've probably just put your question in the chat, haven't you? So
I can summarize if you want, but
no, well,
do we have time or no?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I appreciate that we are over our time. If anyone needs to leave, please feel free to do so. But let's just capture Abby's question and have an answer to that.
Thanks, Gian Luigi and Caroline. Nice to see you again. And as always, very interesting on the frameworks. I have to say, one of my first jobs when I was a fresh-faced young procurement consultant just out of law school was to write the terms and conditions for a framework agreement for a client. And I spent a lot of time puzzling over whether or not this was just a contract or it was something different. So that was how I came to it. And as Gian Luigi pointed out, there's really the approach that's been taken in the UK and Ireland to a large extent as well is different. And I think that reflects legal culture and institutional public sector culture. More broadly, it's not limited to framework agreements. But the point I was making in the chat, and I might just reiterate it, is that I think we see in this area this trade-off that has come up. We've discussed it before in POGO, this idea that, where you want to have flexible rules or flexible approach to something, it immediately becomes more complicated. And when you look at the provisions in the 2014 directives on frameworks, they are trying to give some flexibility and really acknowledging that public authorities do very different things with framework agreements, but to give some degree of certainty to what the process involves. And I think it's not an easy one to solve. We want both. We want flexibility and we also want simplicity, but it's very difficult to reconcile those two. But the one point I would raise is that where we have very rigid rules, where you have a framework agreement that essentially determines everything that's going to happen in a contract. I just question how realistic it is for the public authority who ultimately has to receive. I mean, if it's very simple goods, that might be one thing. But if it's a service contract, do they really have the exact same need as another public body that can be determined in that much certainty in advance? And can the service provider really meet their needs according to an agreement that was negotiated by a different authority somewhere else with perhaps different priorities and a different understanding? So I do think there's some risk that where we have a very rigid approach to framework agreements, we end up having parallel negotiations or parallel interactions between at the actual contract delivery phase. But I don't know whether that's something that you've thought about, Gian Luigi or Caroline, or come across.
I don't know, Abby. I mean, the point is, give me an example. So what kind of services, like, let me put it this way. The easy answer would be, even if you rule out kind of, under the table negotiation or amendments which aren't written at the second stage, contracting authorities, for instance, I'll provide you the example of Italy, which is, I would say, at the forefront of as an example in which a lot of local authorities don't want to bother about a lot of this procurement stuff. So they keep complaining about our framework agreements, which are with everything is established, that we normally call frame contract, but they're happy. Okay, it's like when you I would say in some parts of the south of Italy, you had to marry a woman or a man. You weren't happy, but at the end, it solved a lot of problems. Used to be the case, still is the case in some circumstances. They keep complaining, so the contract does not fit or does not meet their needs completely, but they have their problem solved. Okay, it's the usual, there's one of standard slides that I have to say, okay, that's a trade-off between sort of giving up the idea of tailoring the contract to your needs, but you don't have to worry about it anymore. And there will always be a culprit every single time there is a problem, there will always be one culprit, which is me, the one in charge of designing. I am the one, all right? You can make a phone call to Rome and say, you, okay, beep, beep, people in Rome, that you did everything wrong. I mean, that's the story. And we're happy with this. We're happy because one of our mission is to recognize that there is a lack of know-how, especially at the local level. And Elena, I think, is exploring this. And so there are two ways out. Either you make massive investments in trying to train everybody, and then you end up discovering that basically everybody is repeating exactly the same kind of procurement, right? Or you say, well, you know what, guys, I'm going to bundle this. I'm going to gather a little bit of information about what you need. I'm going to be in a reasonable compromise. No one is going to be happy, but you're going to have your contract ready to use. There is a loss and a gain. So. Yeah. So it depends on
the question I have is what's actually happening on the ground. So if, let's say, there's a central framework for garden maintenance services, and I'm a small town and I'm going to purchase garden maintenance services from your framework. But in reality, what I need is somewhat different. So I say to the contractor, actually, I need something different. He says, that's fine, but you can pay me extra outside of the contract. It's just a very easy, and I'm not saying specifically, I mean, we have the same situation in Ireland where there's a compulsion to use central frameworks. And they, I'm not saying that they're bad frameworks, but they just don't fit everybody's needs.
I know, but if you enter, I mean, the point would be once you enter the sort of the pathology aspect of this, then I could sort of provide you a counter example by saying, okay, let's suppose you have a two-stage framework agreement in which you can reopen competition. And then under the table, there will be a negotiation because there will be 3 guys competing, and one of the 3 guys is bigger than the others, and then we'll push the public procurement officer to put in the technical specification the extra dimension that would favor that particular supplier rather than the other 2, and then you would end up with the same manipulation. So, I mean, you want a list of pathologies? I can write 10 more books. How much time do we have?
None.
No, the point is once you enter that word, I mean, there is nothing you can do. I do know. We know there is a problem. We have experienced problems on the other side with other completely opposite solutions, and hard to say. I mean, at some point you have to make a choice in terms. Again, I'm sorry to sound like obsessive about this, but as an economist, you have to be clear about what your priorities are. And then our Minister of Economy and Finance has always been hammering off this point that you have to save on transaction costs and on you have to make savings. This has been our sort of morning prayer for 15 years. And if this is the ambition, if this is the objective, there's nothing you can do. Then the only thing you can do is to be consistent with this objective. Now, if you change the objective, I will change the design. But my ambition is to be coherent with the objective. But I don't write the objectives. That's the point. Okay.
Just to add very briefly, if I may, the US has some interesting experience that I was reading about in trying to get, even on a goods level, more standardization, particularly buying commercial off-the-shelves items. And I think your other point about framework agreements are just like procurement in a microcosm. It's exactly the same issue. And Rory's put in the chat that many centralized purchasing agencies come across as being very rigid. And I think this is all in the eye of the beholder, because from a public policy perspective, a lot of central governments are saying, look, it's ridiculous that, this area buys this type of scalpels and this area buys this type of scalpels. So I think you've got, between the sort of central and local governments, there's a huge amount of tension pushing in different directions. And if we could fix it now, we'd all be probably not needing to sit on a procurement webinar. We'd all be sitting on our own Caribbean island, actually.
I love the thought of that. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to bring what is clearly an interesting discussion to a close, but we are well over our time now, and we do need to stop, in fairness to people who've got other things to go and do. So massive thank you to Gian Luigi and Caroline for their book and for the presentation and for sparking off that interesting discussion. And also thank you to Elena for her presentation earlier.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much indeed, and hopefully we'll see you on our next call in April. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.